demand we have to get into, and the whole party has to get into, and I think it's well down the road of doing that, as it starts to see the advantages of a 5-year parliament where we can tackle the huge problems that we know we have. And this government is going to have to do, it's attempting a challenge that no government has had to attempt for 60 years in terms of the scale of the deficit. And stability, strong government in the national interest, is the best way of even attempting to deliver what has to be done. George, and then Vince.
Yes, I mean, to pick up on the point you made, there is an urgent priority, which is to get lending going to small and medium-sized businesses. And I think all of us had the experience in the general election of every single day virtually going to a small or medium-sized business as part of the campaign trail, and all, wherever you were in the country, hearing basically the same problem. Vince and I are agreed that that is an absolute urgent priority. Now, we both had different ideas about how to do that. The Liberal Democrats talked about net lending for nationalised banks. We had a loan guarantee scheme. We might do both. We might do one or the other, but we're agreed we're going to sit down, work out which one works and gets the money into the economy. There is a separate issue then on the structure of banking going forward and the relationship between retail banking and investment banking. Now, you might remember that the previous Prime Minister simply ruled out any discussion of this, ignored the advice he was getting from people like the Bank of England governor, didn't want to hear any alternate view, and just proclaimed that the government didn't want to even look at the issue. I think that was wrong. I think this is a really interesting and challenging problem for the United Kingdom. We have a large financial services sector. It employs a lot of people. It's a very important industry for us, but it's also clearly done a lot of damage to the British economy. And there's a real debate with a lot of intellectual effort required to discuss this relationship between retail and investment banking, and setting up a commission, a high-powered commission that will report in pretty short order, given the scale of the issues and complexity of the issues it needs to investigate. Setting that up and allowing the different views held by all sorts of different people. I mean, some people on the right passionately in favour of splitting banking, some people on the left passionately against it, but bringing it together in this way, I think, shows a grown-up approach that allows these arguments to be aired and then decided upon rather than simply dismissed.
Well, I think the Prime Minister's already made the key point that the two issues of net lending and the structure are separate issues. The net lending issue is very urgent because there is clear analysis now from the Bank of England and elsewhere, not just anecdote, that the demand is rising as we get recovery, the supply of funds is not coming forward, and we're going to have to act urgently and decisively to deal with that.
Andy Bell.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Andy Bell, 5 News. Just to return to this idea that there are a lot of commissions in this document, there's another one about the Bill of Rights, for instance. It does rather look as if each time you hit a problem, you have a commission, you push the decision off. Are you not just papering over the cracks between your two parties, which are going to break out sooner or later?
I mean, it's obviously a bad start to accuse the press of churlishness, but I think when you look at this document, the amount of sentences that start with "we will" and do not include the reference to a commission is, I think, incredibly striking. There are so many commitments that are doable, deliverable, bankable in this document. I think it's a great credit to Danny Alexander and Oliver Letwin, who did a huge amount of the heavy lifting. I mean, let's be clear about what's happened here. You know, within about a week, we have produced a full programme for government, and we've also produced, within a week, a set of savings in terms of in-year savings to start to get the budget deficit under control. One of the privileges of my new responsibilities is talking to prime ministers across Europe and having introductory phone calls. You know, this process in many other countries takes 40 days, takes 80 days. You know, two parties who hadn't previously worked together at the national level have managed to crunch that in about 9. I think that is very impressive, and I think it's the shortage of commissions rather than the amount of them that Her Majesty's Press Corps should be looking at. Tom.
Prime Minister, returning to your Conservative voters, just to clarify 2 things that I think were in the Conservative Party manifesto which appear to be out of the document. One is the promise to eradicate the bulk of the deficit. You're now just promising to accelerate the reduction of it. And the second one is the promise in the Conservative Party manifesto to reduce immigration into the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands, that also appears not to be in your programme.
Well, let me take the second first, and I'll ask George to answer the first of your questions. In terms of immigration, what you can see is that there is a cap going to be put in place, and yes, that is with the ambition of getting to a levels of net migration that were prevalent in the 80s and 90s, which is tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands. That is the ambition. That's what we want to achieve, and we have a set of policies that will deliver that. It's clearly a big change that needs to take place, and we need to now set out how we're going to put the cap in place and how the consultations on that operate. But this is, again, an important part of the agenda that was secured in the negotiations that we had, bringing the coalition together. Bulk of deficit.
Well, they're exactly the same, Tom. I mean, if you significantly accelerate the reduction in the structural budget deficit, you will eliminate the bulk of the deficit, at least over the Parliament. And, of course, the phrase I was using during the general election was a phrase borrowed from the Governor of the Bank of England. And I think a pretty remarkable event last week was the Governor of the Bank on the very first day coming out and welcoming, he doesn't normally comment like that on fiscal policy, but given the severity of the economic problems we face and given this challenge of high inflation and the need to keep interest rates lower for longer for reasons of encouraging the recovery, I think for him to come out and say that was significant. So they are exactly the same thing, and it is at the heart of the agreement. It is on the first page of the coalition agreement that I helped negotiate last week, and it is, of course, absolutely central to this programme. Indeed, it's there on the back page in a nice green box right there. The deficit reduction programme takes precedence, and that's very, very important.
Guardian and the Telegraph.
Could I ask what this proposal is to fund 200 all-postal primaries targeted seats which have not changed hands for many years? I've never heard of that proposal before. And could I also ask, you've kept the goal of ending child poverty by 2020. Will you not change the definition of what child poverty is as well?
On the primaries, I'll say a word about that before asking Nick with his responsibilities for political reform. We had an all-postal primary in South Devon, in Totnes, in the last Parliament, and I think it was a very good way of engaging a huge number of people, basically ballot papers sent to every voter in the constituency to choose the Conservative candidate. And I think that is a good way of opening up politics. Now, there's obviously a particular logic of doing this in seats which tend not to have changed hands, because you're bringing, which is expensive, it does cost money, but you're opening up primaries into areas where the constituency hasn't changed hands, so there's a greater logic for doing it. That is the idea, that's the proposal. I think all parties will see its great merit, and I think it's something that we can deliver. I'll ask Nick to expand on that, and then, George, if you want to answer the question on child poverty.
Patrick, certainly you are. Yep. No, I mean, the Prime Minister said it. This is part of a process which will just open up the culture of safe seats. We've got scores and scores and scores of MPs in constituencies where they basically have their seats for life, no questions asked, where the constituency has been in the same hands since the Second World War. And part and parcel of the many reforms we're going to introduce is to, of course, increase accountability, increase choice. And having these primaries made available to all the political parties, targeted in those areas where constituencies have always been in the same hands for decades, is part of that process.
Just add the point, I don't take anything for granted. I should be in my constituency on Friday having constituency surgery in the proper way. George.
Well, the document makes clear we want to maintain the goal of eliminating child poverty by 2020. Of course, we start with this big challenge, which is the Labour government didn't get far enough down the road on its own terms. But it's a very important ambition for us. It's about creating a fairer society. I think our insight that we bring to the table is it's not just about money. Of course, poverty is about relative income, but it's also about life chances. And I think a huge part of this programme and a huge part of the Queen's speech will be the big structural reforms to education and welfare in particular, which I think will help raise the life chances of people born into poverty and give them a route out.
I'm not sure you answered whether you're going to change the definition. I can see you may change the way in which you try to bring about that.
You know, there is legislation on the statute book which we, didn't oppose. So, and the definition is set out in that statute.